Nobody in the kingdom understood why the Alpha King would threaten an entire royal court for a servant girl who owned nothing but a faded apron and a quiet smile. The warning spread through Blackwood Palace before sunrise, whispered through marble hallways and beneath towering crystal chandeliers. By breakfast, every noble, guard, and servant had heard the same impossible words. "Wake the Omega maid on my chest, and you die." No one dared test whether King Alexander Blackwood meant it. The great hall stood frozen in uneasy silence. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, painting ribbons of gold across the polished floor. Yet not a single person moved closer. At the center of the room, upon a raised platform near the throne, the Alpha King sat in a high-backed chair carved from dark oak. His posture was perfectly still. His silver eyes remained fixed on the crowd, and resting peacefully against his chest was a young Omega maid named Evelyn Carter. Her breathing was slow and even. One hand remained curled against the fabric of the king's black coat, as though she had fallen asleep without realizing where she was. A few nobles exchanged nervous glances. Others looked away entirely. Evelyn had worked in the palace for nearly 3 years, yet most of them barely remembered her name. She was the girl who cleaned empty hallways before dawn, the girl who carried fresh linens through servant corridors, the girl who always lowered her gaze when nobles passed. Invisible, forgettable, unimportant. Yet somehow that same forgotten Omega now slept in the safest place in the entire kingdom. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly as another council member shifted in place. The movement alone drew the king's attention. Instantly the older noble froze. No one wanted to be the next target of that cold stare. Because everyone in Blackwood knew one thing. Alexander Blackwood never repeated himself. The royal advisor cleared his throat carefully. "Your Majesty," he began, choosing each word as though stepping across thin ice. "The council meeting was scheduled to begin 30 minutes ago." The king's expression did not change. "Then wait." The advisor opened his mouth, thought better of it, and bowed. Around them, confusion hung heavy in the air. Some believed the king had finally lost patience with royal traditions. Others suspected a political strategy. A few wondered whether the moon goddess herself had intervened. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew what had happened 4 nights earlier beneath a storm-filled sky. None of them knew how close the kingdom had come to losing its king. And none of them knew why the frightened Omega sleeping peacefully against his chest had become the one person Alexander refused to leave behind. Evelyn shifted slightly in her sleep. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Alexander immediately lowered his gaze toward her. The hardness in his eyes softened for a brief moment. So brief most people questioned whether they had imagined it. Then she settled again, and the king relaxed. Outside, bells rang across the capital city. Another day had begun. Inside the palace, however, nothing felt normal anymore. Because for the first time in living memory, the most feared Alpha King in the north was protecting someone. And the someone he had chosen was the one person nobody had ever noticed. The fear inside the great hall did not come from what people saw. It came from what they could not understand. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne stood near the council table, watching the sleeping Omega with narrowed eyes. She had attended royal gatherings for nearly 20 years, and never once had she witnessed Alexander Blackwood place anyone above the kingdom's business. Yet there he sat, unmoving, while ministers delayed reports, merchants waited for approvals, and nobles whispered behind gloved hands. Something had changed and nobody knew why. Across the room, young servants exchanged nervous looks. They knew Evelyn better than the nobles did. She was the girl who arrived before sunrise and left long after dusk. She never complained when assigned the coldest corridors in winter. She never argued when extra duties appeared on her schedule. If another servant forgot lunch, Evelyn shared hers. If someone was sick, she quietly covered their work. Yet kindness rarely earned respect in Blackwood Palace. Most people simply expected it from her. A kitchen maid named Clara twisted her apron anxiously. She remembered seeing Evelyn only yesterday morning carrying fresh linens through the eastern wing. Nothing about the young Omega had seemed unusual. Her blonde hair had been tied back neatly. Her pale blue eyes had stayed focused on her work. She had smiled politely and continued walking. Now the entire kingdom seemed to revolve around her. Clara glanced toward the throne again. It felt unreal. The Alpha King rarely looked at anyone for longer than necessary. Yet every few moments his attention drifted back toward Evelyn as if confirming she was still there. The contrast unsettled everyone. Near the windows, 2 royal guards spoke quietly. They had protected the king for years and understood his reputation better than most. Alexander was fair. He was disciplined. He was respected. But he was never sentimental. Never. Which raised a troubling question neither guard wanted to ask aloud. What could possibly make a king guard a servant with such determination? The answer remained hidden somewhere in the past. 4 nights earlier, a violent storm had swept across the northern territories. Rain had hammered the palace roofs. Thunder had shaken ancient stone walls. While most of the kingdom slept, events had unfolded that would alter countless lives. But those answers had not reached the Great Hall yet. All anyone had was speculation. Evelyn stirred slightly again, her expression peaceful despite the tension surrounding her. She seemed completely unaware that ministers had postponed meetings, nobles had forgotten their arguments, and dozens of people were watching her every breath. A faint smile touched her face, as though she were dreaming of something warm and familiar. For a brief moment, Alexander looked less like a king and more like a man carrying a burden nobody else could see. Then his expression hardened once more. Outside, dark clouds drifted away from the capital, revealing clear blue skies. Inside the palace, uncertainty continued to grow, because every passing minute made one truth impossible to ignore. The forgotten Omega maid whom nobody had noticed yesterday had somehow become the most important person in Blackwood Palace today. 4 nights earlier, the palace had felt entirely different. Rain hammered against the tall windows of Blackwood Palace, turning the world beyond the glass into a blur of silver and shadow. Most servants had already retired to their quarters. The grand hallway stood nearly empty except for a few guards making their rounds. Evelyn Carter hurried through the western corridor carrying a basket of freshly folded blankets against her chest. Her shift had ended nearly an hour before, but one of the older housekeepers had fallen ill, and Evelyn had volunteered to finish the remaining tasks. She always did. The storm rattled the windows again. Somewhere far above, thunder rolled across the mountains surrounding the capital. Evelyn glanced toward the dark sky and quickened her pace. She hoped to return to the servant wing before the weather worsened. As she passed a rarely used hallway near the royal library, she stopped. At first she thought she had imagined it. Then she heard it again. A sound. Soft. Uneven. Like someone struggling to catch their breath. Her heart skipped. Few people ever used this section of the palace after sunset. Evelyn carefully set down her basket and followed the sound. The corridor stretched ahead in dim candlelight. Portraits of long-forgotten rulers watched silently from gilded frames. The sound came again. This time closer. Evelyn turned the corner and froze. A man sat alone against the wall near an arched window. His dark coat was soaked from the storm. Rainwater dripped onto the marble floor beneath him. His head was lowered slightly, one hand pressed against his chest as though trying to steady himself. Evelyn immediately looked away. Palace servants were taught never to interfere with nobles unless asked. Yet something about the scene troubled her. The man seemed completely alone. No guards. No attendants. No advisors. Just silence in the storm. "Sir," she asked softly, "are you all right?" The man lifted his head. Even in the dim light, his silver eyes seemed unusually bright. Evelyn had never seen him before. At least she did not think she had. His expression remained guarded. "You should not be here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but exhaustion lingered beneath it. Evelyn hesitated. "Neither should you." For a second, surprise flickered across his face. Then it disappeared. Another distant rumble of thunder shook the windows. Evelyn noticed his hand trembling slightly before he clenched it into a fist. Concern outweighed caution. She knelt beside the basket and removed one of the blankets. "You are freezing," she said. "At least take this." The stranger studied her as though she had spoken a language he had forgotten. Nobody important accepted help from servants. Everyone knew that. Yet after a long moment, he allowed her to drape the blanket across his shoulders. "Why would you help someone you do not know?" he asked. Evelyn blinked. The question seemed strange. "Because you look like you need it." For the first time, the man looked genuinely speechless. Outside, rain continued to fall against the palace walls. Inside, neither of them noticed that fate had quietly begun changing both their lives. The stranger accepted the blanket, but neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain traced crooked paths down the tall window behind him while candlelight flickered across the polished floor. Evelyn could not explain why she remained there. Normally she would have apologized for interrupting and hurried back to work. Yet something about the man seemed different. Not frightening, not arrogant, just tired in a way that reached beyond physical exhaustion. "You should sit," she said gently. "You look like you have not rested in days." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It vanished so quickly she wondered whether she had imagined it. "That obvious?" he asked. "A little." The answer slipped out before she could stop herself. To her surprise, the stranger did not seem offended. Instead, he looked toward the storm beyond the glass. "Most people avoid me when I look tired." Evelyn tilted her head. "That does not seem very kind." This time the smile stayed a little longer. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower struck midnight. The sound echoed through the sleeping palace. Evelyn suddenly remembered the basket waiting in the corridor. She should leave. She knew that. Yet her feet refused to move. "Do you work here every night?" the stranger asked. "Most nights." "And you volunteered to help someone you have never met?" Evelyn shrugged. "Someone once helped me when I needed it. I suppose I never forgot." The stranger studied her quietly. For reasons he could not explain, her words settled somewhere deep inside him. He had spent years surrounded by advisors, generals, nobles, and diplomats. Every conversation carried an agenda. Every gesture came with expectations. Yet this Omega maid offered kindness without asking for anything in return. It felt unfamiliar, dangerous even, because it made him want to trust her. A draft swept through the corridor. Evelyn noticed the stranger suppress a shiver beneath the blanket. Without thinking, she reached into her basket again and removed a small cloth bundle. "I saved this from dinner." She held it out. "It is only bread and tea, but it is warm." The stranger stared at the offering. No one had handed him food in years. Meals appeared automatically wherever he went. Servants bowed. Chefs prepared elaborate feasts. Yet somehow this simple bundle felt more meaningful than all of it. Slowly he accepted it. "Thank you, Evelyn." Her eyes widened. "How do you know my name?" The question caught him off guard. For a split second he nearly revealed too much. Instead he glanced toward the embroidered initials on her apron. Relief softened her expression. "Right. That makes more sense." The storm outside began to weaken. Thunder faded into the mountains. Evelyn finally stood and brushed invisible dust from her skirt. "You should get some rest, sir." "And you?" "I still have work to finish." The stranger watched her lift the basket once more. As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. For the first time in a very long time, he found himself hoping someone would stay. Evelyn offered a small smile before disappearing around the corner. Long after she was gone, Alexander Blackwood remained by the window holding the untouched bundle of bread and tea, unable to stop thinking about the servant who had treated him like an ordinary man. The following morning, Evelyn convinced herself the encounter had meant nothing. People crossed paths in a palace every day. Important guests arrived. Travelers departed. Strange conversations happened and were forgotten. Yet as she carried fresh towels through the servant wing, she found herself thinking about the silver-eyed stranger far more often than she should. The memory lingered in small details. The tired look in his eyes. The way he had seemed genuinely surprised by simple kindness. The quiet gratitude in his voice. By noon, Evelyn scolded herself for being distracted and returned to work. Unfortunately, the palace had other plans. "Evelyn." She stopped at the sound of her name. Clara hurried toward her carrying a basket of folded linens. "You missed breakfast again." Evelyn smiled apologetically. "I was organizing storage shelves." Clara sighed. "One day you are going to work yourself into exhaustion." Before Evelyn could answer, several noblewomen entered the corridor. Instantly both servants stepped aside. The women barely acknowledged their presence. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne paused only long enough to glance at Evelyn. Her expression carried the familiar look servants knew too well. Dismissal. Then she continued walking. Evelyn lowered her gaze until they disappeared around the corner. Nothing unusual. Nothing new. Yet high above the palace, events were already unfolding beyond her knowledge. Inside the royal council chamber, Alexander Blackwood sat at the head of a long table while advisors discussed trade routes, harvest forecasts, and diplomatic requests. He heard every word. He responded when necessary, but part of his attention remained elsewhere. "Your Majesty?" The royal advisor repeated the question. Alexander blinked. "Continue." Several council members exchanged surprised looks. Their king rarely lost focus. Never. The meeting resumed, but Alexander's thoughts drifted back to a rain-soaked corridor and a young Omega who had offered help without hesitation. He could still remember the warmth of the blanket she had placed across his shoulders. He could still remember the simple certainty in her voice when she said someone looked like they needed help. No fear. No ambition. No expectation of reward. It bothered him more than he cared to admit, because he had spent years believing genuine kindness no longer existed inside palace walls. By late afternoon, he found himself asking a question he should not have asked. The servant named Evelyn Carter. The room fell silent. Several advisors looked startled. "What about her, Your Majesty?" Alexander remained expressionless. "How long has she worked here?" The advisor shuffled through records. "Nearly 3 years." "Any disciplinary reports?" "None." "Complaints?" "None." The advisor hesitated. "In fact, everyone seems to speak highly of her." Alexander gave a short nod and dismissed the subject. Yet after the meeting ended, the advisors continued whispering among themselves. Why would the Alpha King ask about a servant? Meanwhile, Evelyn finished another long day without realizing she had become the topic of conversations taking place in the highest rooms of the kingdom. As sunset painted the palace windows gold, she stepped outside for a rare moment of quiet. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine from distant forests. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe. Then a strange sensation brushed across her awareness. Brief, faint, almost impossible to describe. Felt like being watched. Evelyn turned slowly. The courtyard stood nearly empty. No one appeared to be there. Yet somewhere above, behind the glass of a palace window, silver eyes followed her with growing curiosity. The feeling should have disappeared the moment Evelyn returned to work. Instead, it followed her through the next 2 days like a question she could not answer. Every time she entered a room, she found herself glancing toward windows, balconies, and distant hallways. Nothing unusual ever appeared. No one called her name. No one approached her. Yet the sensation remained. On the third evening, preparations began for the annual moonlight reception, a formal gathering attended by nobles, merchants, and visiting dignitaries from across the northern territories. Servants rushed through the palace carrying flowers, silver trays, and crystal lanterns. The entire building seemed to hum with nervous energy. Evelyn spent most of the afternoon helping decorate the grand ballroom. By sunset, hundreds of candles filled the room with warm golden light. Music drifted softly from a chamber orchestra warming up near the stage. It was beautiful. Far more beautiful than anything she could have imagined as a child. Yet servants were not permitted to attend the celebration itself. Their role ended once the guests arrived. Or so Evelyn believed. As she adjusted a final arrangement of white roses near the eastern staircase, a palace steward approached carrying a sealed envelope. "Evelyn Carter?" he asked. She blinked in surprise. "Yes. This is for you." The envelope bore the royal crest. Her hands immediately grew cold. "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake." The steward offered a respectful bow and departed before she could ask another question. Evelyn stared at the seal for several seconds before carefully opening it. Inside was a single card. Her eyes widened as she read the message. By order of the Crown, Evelyn Carter is requested to attend the moonlight reception this evening. She read the words 3 times. Then a fourth. Nothing changed. Her name remained there. Her invitation remained real. Around her, several servants gathered with open curiosity. Clara nearly dropped a basket when she saw the card. "Evelyn, that is impossible." "I know. Servants do not receive invitations." "I know that too." Yet somehow one rested in her trembling hands. News traveled quickly through the palace. By the time evening arrived, whispers followed her everywhere. Some servants were excited for her. Others were suspicious. A few seemed openly worried. Meanwhile, several floors above, Alexander Blackwood stood alone in his private study overlooking the palace grounds. A trusted advisor entered quietly. The invitation was delivered. Alexander nodded once. And half the palace is talking about it. A faint expression touched the king's face. Not amusement exactly. Something softer. Good. The advisor hesitated. May I ask why this particular servant matters? Alexander walked toward the window and looked down at the illuminated courtyard below. Somewhere among hundreds of people preparing for the evening stood the one person who had treated him as something other than a king. Not yet, he answered. And for the first time in years, Alexander found himself looking forward to a royal celebration. Because before the night ended, fate intended to place Evelyn Carter directly in his path once again. By the time Evelyn arrived outside the ballroom, she was certain someone would stop her and explain that the invitation had been delivered by mistake. The grand double doors towered nearly 15 feet high, decorated with silver carvings that reflected the glow of hundreds of lanterns. Nobles in elegant gowns and tailored suits moved through the entrance while attendants welcomed guests by name. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, suddenly aware of how simple her pale blue dress looked compared to everyone else. Clara had spent an hour helping her prepare, insisting she could not arrive looking like she had just finished organizing storage closets. Even so, Evelyn felt painfully out of place. She took a slow breath and stepped inside. The ballroom seemed even larger than she remembered. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like captured starlight. Music drifted through the air. Laughter echoed from every corner. Conversations paused as people noticed her entering. First, only a few heads turned. Then more followed. Whispering spread through the crowd like a ripple across still water. Evelyn immediately regretted coming. She lowered her gaze and moved carefully along the edge of the room, hoping to avoid attention. Unfortunately, attention seemed determined to find her. Interesting. The voice came from her left. Evelyn looked up to find Lady Beatrice Hawthorne watching her closely. Several nobles stood nearby. It appears palace servants receive royal invitations now. The comment sounded polite. The meaning behind it was not. A few people smiled into their glasses. Others exchanged knowing looks. Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was invited, my lady, she answered quietly. So we have heard. Lady Beatrice studied her for a moment longer. One wonders why. Evelyn had no answer. The truth was she wondered the same thing. Before the conversation could continue, movement near the ballroom entrance changed everything. The orchestra fell silent. Conversations stopped. Every guest turned toward the doors. The Alpha King had arrived. Alexander Blackwood entered with the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to commanding entire rooms without speaking a word. Dressed in black formal attire, he moved through the crowd while nobles bowed respectfully. Yet tonight something felt different. His attention was not on diplomats, advisors, or visiting dignitaries. Seemed to be searching. Evelyn instinctively stepped farther back, hoping to disappear among the guests. Then his silver eyes found her. The world seemed to pause. For one impossible second, the noise, music, and movement around her faded into the background. She recognized those eyes immediately. The stranger from the storm. Her breath caught. Shock rushed through her so quickly she nearly forgot how to move. The man she had offered tea and a blanket was not a traveler. He was not a forgotten guest. He was Alexander Blackwood himself. Realization swept across her face. Across the ballroom, Alexander noticed. And for the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared in the eyes of the Alpha King. Because after days of wondering, Evelyn Carter had finally learned exactly who she had helped that stormy night. The realization struck Evelyn so hard that she forgot every rule of royal etiquette she had ever learned. Her mind raced back through every moment in the stormlit corridor. The blanket, the tea, the conversation. She had spoken to the Alpha King as though he were an ordinary traveler. Around her, nobles continued bowing respectfully as Alexander crossed the ballroom. Yet his attention never left her. Evelyn considered retreating. The nearest exit suddenly seemed very appealing. Unfortunately, her feet refused to cooperate. One step, then another. The Alpha King moved through the crowd with calm confidence until he stopped directly in front of her. Silence spread outward in every direction. Conversations vanished. Music faded into the background. Hundreds of eyes watched the scene unfold. "Good evening, Evelyn." The familiar voice immediately transported her back to that rainy night. She lowered her gaze quickly. "Your Majesty." Alexander studied her expression. "You seem surprised." A few nearby nobles nearly stopped breathing. The king was making conversation with a servant, not issuing instructions, not discussing palace business, simply talking. Evelyn searched desperately for the right words. "I did not know who you were." To her relief, Alexander did not appear offended. "I know." The answer carried an unexpected warmth. "If you had known, you probably would not have stayed." Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it again. The uncomfortable truth was that he was right. She would have bowed and left immediately. "Thank you," Alexander said quietly. She blinked. "For what?" "For helping someone when you believed there was nothing to gain from it." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Before she could respond, movement nearby interrupted the moment. Lady Beatrice approached with a practiced smile. "Your Majesty, several guests have been hoping for an introduction." Alexander glanced toward her. The temperature in the conversation seemed to change instantly. "Then they may continue hoping." The noblewoman's smile faltered. Several people looked away to hide their reactions. Evelyn felt her heart skip. The Alpha King had dismissed one of the most influential women in the kingdom without hesitation. Worse, he had done it while standing beside her. Whispering immediately began spreading through the ballroom. Alexander ignored every word. "Have you eaten dinner?" he asked. The question seemed absurdly normal compared to everything else happening. "Not yet." "Then you should." A servant appeared almost immediately with refreshments. Evelyn stared in disbelief. She had worked inside the palace for years. Never once had service arrived that quickly for her. The evening continued, but something had shifted. Nobles who had once ignored her now watched carefully. Advisors exchanged concerned looks. Rumors multiplied with every passing minute. And through it all, Alexander remained unusually attentive to the quiet Omega, who clearly had no idea how much attention she was attracting. By the time the reception neared its end, one fact had become impossible for anyone in the ballroom to deny. Evelyn Carter was no longer invisible. And somewhere deep within the crowd, a handful of powerful people had already begun wondering how to separate a palace servant from the growing interest of a king. The moonlight reception ended, but its consequences did not. For the next several days, Blackwood Palace felt different. Conversations stopped when Evelyn entered a room. Servants who had barely noticed her before suddenly greeted her with nervous smiles. Noble guests lingered longer than necessary whenever she passed through a hallway. Some looked curious. Others looked concerned. Evelyn wished she could return to being invisible. Unfortunately, that seemed impossible now. The greatest change came from Alexander himself. He never summoned her unnecessarily. He never placed her in uncomfortable situations. Yet somehow she kept crossing paths with him. In the library. In the palace gardens. In quiet corridors lined with portraits of former kings. Each encounter felt natural and strangely easy. They spoke about books, weather, and childhood memories. Nothing dramatic. Nothing improper. Yet with every conversation, Evelyn found herself looking forward to the next one. One afternoon, while organizing records in an old storage room, she discovered a dusty wooden box hidden behind several ledgers. Curious, she opened it carefully. Inside rested dozens of documents marked with an unfamiliar silver crest. At the center lay a faded portrait of a woman with pale blue eyes identical to her own. Evelyn stared in shock. She had never seen the painting before. Before she could examine it further, footsteps approached. Alexander appeared in the doorway. His expression changed the moment he saw what she was holding. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. Evelyn pointed toward the shelf. "Who is she?" For several seconds Alexander simply looked at the portrait. Then he answered, "Your grandmother." Evelyn felt the room tilt slightly. "That is impossible." No, his voice remained calm. It is the truth. He crossed the room and carefully lifted one of the documents from the box. Many years ago, one branch of an ancient family disappeared from public records. Most people believed the bloodline ended. Evelyn struggled to understand. Why are these hidden here? Alexander met her gaze. Because some secrets were protected, not forgotten. Silence settled between them. Questions filled her mind faster than she could ask them. Her family had always seemed ordinary. Her parents had never spoken of ancient bloodlines or hidden histories. Yet the evidence rested directly in front of her. The portrait, the documents, the silver crest. None of it could be ignored. A soft breeze drifted through the open window. Somewhere outside, palace bells rang across the capital. Alexander stepped closer. There is much you do not know yet. His voice carried a certainty that made her heart race. About your family. About your past. About why certain people have taken an interest in you. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the portrait once more. The woman in the painting seemed familiar despite being a stranger. For the first time, she began to suspect that her story had started long before she was born. And as the afternoon sunlight spilled across the hidden documents, neither Evelyn nor Alexander realized that the greatest secret of all was still waiting to be uncovered.